None of the tombs were booby traps. There were false doors to some tombs, a corridor designed to lead a potential thief to a dead end. I'm Anthony Browder, author of Nile Valley Contributions to Civilization and director of the ASA Restoration Project, currently excavating and restoring 3 Kushite tombs. Today we're going to be looking at ancient Egyptian history and film and determining how real they are. The top of a sarcophagus that size would have weighed more than an automobile. All of the sarcophagi that I've seen in Egypt were made of stone. If you can imagine trying to push an automobile with 2 hands, it would have been impossible. The thieves who broke into tombs such as these, they were typically several men, and they used heavy-duty instruments.
Where's the Ushapti?
Oh, well. There would be jewelry on the mummy, as we saw in this instance. You would find that there were little caps that were put on their fingers.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Gray.
They reference the swapti. Swapti are small figurines of the departed soul that were supposedly built to assist the dead in the afterlife. Swaptis were never put inside of the bodies of a mummy. They were typically buried around them, outside of the sarcophagus, and in some instances, there were boxes that contained swaptis. The idea of someone going into a tomb and desecrating a tomb, as this character does, is quite troubling. These are historical artifacts that are priceless. There are hundreds of tombs in Egypt that have been raided similar to this. It's been happening for thousands of years. I would rate it 0 for historical accuracy. One of the things that I liked about this particular film, if you were to walk into a well-preserved tomb, the colors would be as vibrant today as they were when the tomb was created 3,000 years ago. One of the most spectacular tombs in Egypt in the Valley of the Kings is the tomb of Seti I, and the colors are so rich, so vibrant. It looks as if it was just painted recently. The images on the wall of a priest coming before Osiris, that is an image that comes from the papyrus of Hunefer. So this is an accurate depiction of a 19th dynasty personality. It is a depiction that comes straight from his papyrus, and so I appreciate the attention to detail. These glyphs depicted in this scene are not accurate glyphs. The one symbol that is accurate is the wavy line, and that's an easy glyph to replicate. It's gibberish, but it looks good. It helps to sell the movie. I'm not aware of any of the ancient Egyptians using a quartz crystal, if you will, to illuminate a specific portion of a temple or a tomb. But what we do know is that there were a number of temples in ancient Egypt which were oriented to the sun. For example, at Karnak Temple, there is an event that takes place every winter at the winter solstice. A beam of sunlight shines down the eastern part of the temple, and it would illuminate this room with a ray of light similar to what you see here in the film. I would give it a 10 for production value. The set designer gets a lot of credit for doing their research. What you saw in this battle scene were what I consider to be fairly accurate representations of the chariots, of the armor, and the weapons that were used by the ancient Egyptians and their enemies. There was a chariot buried in King Tut's tomb, and King Tut lived about 100 years before Ramesses, who we see in this particular scene. There are many texts in Egypt that describe battles such as this. The most famous archers in the Egyptian army were the Nubians. They were considered the best archers in the Nile Valley. Typically, one would find on the outer pylon of temples images of the king in a chariot going into battle to defend Egypt against the enemies of Egypt. This was, I guess, royal propaganda to show that the king was the protector of the land. Ridley Scott directed this particular film, he gives great attention to detail. I give him a 10 on this depiction.
Thebes, home of Imhotep, Pharaoh's high priest, keeper of the dead.
Well, actually, Imhotep was a 3rd dynasty priest to the king Zoser in Saqqara, which is in northern Egypt. Imhotep was a historical personality who was responsible for creating the step pyramid of Saqqara. Imhotep is also considered to be the world's first multi-genius. He was a physician, deified by the Greeks. He also was an architect and an engineer.
Birthplace of Anaxunamun, Pharaoh's mistress.
Yattamitatan.
The reference to Anxanamen as the mistress of Seti I is an extreme case of someone taking liberty with the truth. Anxanamen was actually the wife of King Tut, who was a 18th dynasty personality, and Seti I was a 19th dynasty personality. So these two historical figures, and they are real historical figures, but they lived about a century apart from each other. So I have no knowledge of Seti I having a mistress by the name of Anxanamen. He is depicted in this film as having murdered the king. There is no historical evidence of Imhotep murdering the king. The representation of Imhotep and the other priests as being clean-shaven was accurate. Typically, every priest in Egypt was clean-shaven. It was an act of cleanliness, and it was an act of respect for the positions that they held within each temple.
Anaxunamun's soul had been sent to the dark underworld, her vital organs removed and placed in 5 sacred canopic jars.
They made reference to her organs were placed in 5 canopic jars. Well, anyone who knows anything about ancient Egyptian history knows that there are only 4 canopic jars: the stomach, the lungs, and some of the other organs. The removal of the organs was to keep the body clean.
The worst of all ancient curses, one so horrible it had never before been bestowed.
The reference to Imhotep's tongue being cut out, to my knowledge, that was not done.
Imhotep's priests were condemned to be mummified alive.
I'm not aware of any person being mummified alive. Mummification was a very time-consuming and expensive process. So there's no reason why a person in the past would have been buried alive. And the process of mummification in ancient Egypt typically took place over the course of 70 days. The idea of booby traps in ancient Egyptian tombs is something that comes from the imagination of film writers. None of the tombs were booby traps. There were false doors to some tombs, a corridor designed to lead a potential thief to a dead end. There were false corridors, and there were shafts to prevent thieves from coming in to access the treasure that was buried in the tomb, but there were no booby traps that I'm aware of. I would give it a -1. It is wholly historically inaccurate. As they're moving this very heavy statue, they're asking the woman to pour grease underneath the statue. No one knows what methods they actually use to move these heavy objects, and people take liberties at guessing how it was done. Now, there's a famous image in Egypt where men are moving a statue, and you see a person standing on top of the statue and pouring a liquid in front of the statue, implying that this liquid is being used to ease the movement of this statue across the sand.
We don't stop a moving block for an old woman.
Mercy, Prince Lord!
Come here.
Not for myself, Lord Prince. For a slave.
It's an issue that's been debated for centuries, but there is no evidence whatsoever of slaves having built the pyramids. First and foremost, there are 118 pyramids in Egypt. And more specifically, when people speak of pyramids, they're thinking of the 3 great pyramids of Giza, the pyramids of Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure. Those pyramids were all built during the 4th dynasty, which is around 2400 BC. That's at least 1200 years before the story of Moses took place. In recent years, Egyptian archeologists have actually found the tombs of the builders of the pyramids. Adjacent to the Giza Plateau, that honor would not have been given to a slave. We know that it was built by master craftsmen, master masons, master engineers.
Would you bury the old woman alive in a tomb of rock?
And there's also one other misnomer that I think it's important to talk about. The pyramids were not used as tombs. Pyramids were built over tombs. I would rate the depiction of the movement of a large box of stone as accurate. The idea of someone putting grease underneath a block to help ease this movement across the sand, that's not accurate at all. This story depicts the battle between Horus and Set, and it is the second part of the story of the founding of Egypt. This is a story that is over 6,000 years old. In this particular instance, the animal depiction of Set is not a jackal, it's an unidentified animal. A jackal was associated with Anubis, who was the guardian of the dead. He was the person who led the souls into the afterlife. The depiction of Horus as a falcon had to do with the symbolism associated with the falcon. A falcon has keen eyesight.
Doing Egypt a favor. You're not fit to be king.
No, there were not British white guys in Egypt. When this picture came out, there was a great deal of controversy because there's been a great deal of contention over the last 100 years or so as to the race of the Egyptians. And a lot of it, unfortunately, has to do with racism because many of the early founders of Egyptology happened to be white men who believed that black people were inherently inferior to white. The original name for Egypt was Kemet. Kemet is a word which means the land of the blacks. History has been used as a tool to subjugate people and to create false notions of superiority and inferiority.
Toth, I only need
The answer to the riddle of the Sphinx. A child could deduce why you're here.
Thoth, the god of wisdom, science, astronomy, and knowledge, who was known in the original language as Jehuti. In this particular instance, Chad Boseman was quite aware of ancient Egyptian history, and he chose to play this role so that the position of Thoth could be accurately depicted by a person of African ancestry. I appreciate the fact that Chad wanted to add a sense of historical accuracy to this particular character. If I was to rate this film, The Gods of Egypt, I would give it a 0. If I were to rate the scenes with Chadwick Boseman, I would say give it a 5. It contains truth, but it is not true.
I will see to that.
The kohl, the dark lining around the eyes, women wore it and men wore it. That was used primarily as protection from the intense sunlight. It's the same thing that you see on a football field or a baseball field where the athlete would put black underneath their eye to absorb the intense rays of sunlight so that they could see clearly.
In the name of the Senate and the people of Rome, and by their will.
Their representations of the clothing, the headdresses, is pretty accurate based on the physical evidence that was left. The two staffs that we see Cleopatra holding, the crook and the flail. The crook is the shepherd's crook, and it indicates that the king, the ruler, is a shepherd to the people of their country. The flail is an instrument that is similar to a fly swatter, and it's used to swat away distractions, enemies of Egypt. If you combine these two instruments, then what they represent is the king or queen's ability to protect the people of the land and to do away with the enemies of the land who would bring danger and threats to the territory.
There cannot be enough hours in the days of a queen.
Again, the use of white actresses to depict Cleopatra is taking liberties with historical truths based on the archeological evidence that has been found of Cleopatra's sisters and other family members. She was probably closer to Halle Berry than Elizabeth Taylor. Now, there's also very little evidence to indicate how Cleopatra died. So the idea of her holding an asp to her breast and it biting her is fiction. There is no evidence to validate that is how Cleopatra died. I give it a 7. My favorite of the clips that we've seen is Raiders of the Lost Ark. The narrative was fictional, but the presentation of the artifacts was as real as can be. If you enjoyed this video, click the link for more exciting information.